Sega Rally Championship.
Racing games are a staple of any good console, so buckle up, because it doesn't get much better than Sega Rally. Now, I'm sure you, like myself, probably experienced Sega Rally for the first time on that awesome Sega Rally arcade cabinet. I used to go for holidays to the coast of the UK. I'd go on the pier to the arcade and spend way too much money on this game. Luckily for us, it's released on the Sega Saturn, so we don't have to spend stupendous amounts of money playing it anymore. Now in this video we're going to take a look at the development, some gameplay, go over the good, the bad, even though there is no bad, and hopefully give you justification to go out and get this game immediately if you don't have it. But before we do that, let's just do something that I think gets overlooked and just take a look at the artwork, the box, the manual, the overall package that you're getting here. So, Sega Rally in those really bad Sega Saturn cases, which would disintegrate, crack and break like really easily. But luckily for me, this case is in pretty good condition, and actually seems a lot more sturdy than a lot of my other Sega Saturn cases. You can see most Sega Saturn cases will open on a whim, but this one takes a little bit of work to get open. But yeah, the CD sits in there quite nicely. This is still intact and not broken, which I can't say the same for a lot of my other Sega Saturn games. The manual has these holders, which is really good because a lot of the time they don't have these, and then the manual just moves around inside the box and dislodges the CD, and it just ends up causing more damage to your games. So yeah, this is kind of how the Sega Saturn cases should have been, but I feel like maybe they just went cheap and got some lesser quality ones in the end. Manual is really large for an arcade game. Not quite sure why, but yeah, it seems quite large just for an arcade racing game. So yeah, I love the colours on the CD here, and generally the Sega Saturn brand at this point. I love the greens and the reds together. I think that looks really pops and just sums up what Sega Rally is. The artwork itself is, it's got that sort of mid-90s CGI look, but I still think it's very stylized and gives you a good taste of what you're going to get in the game. And I also feel like any Sega Saturn games should have a rally car in these colours on the front, and if it doesn't, is it a Sega Rally game? That's a good question. But yeah, that's the box. I do like this overall package, I've got to say, and yeah, it gives you a good taste of what you're going to get. So let's jump on in to have a look at some development info and play the game and see how it is.
The Sega Rally arcade game was released in 1994 on Sega's awesome Model 2 arcade board. Take note of the Model 2 because I have a feeling it's going to come up constantly in this series of videos, as it's behind some of Sega's best arcade games. Sega in the 90s had large hands in both the arcade market and the home console market, and while they had made attempts to bring the arcade home on the Mega Drive, it was the Sega Saturn that provided the beefy hardware with which to make this vision a reality. The console's design was inspired by Sega's System 32 and Model 1 arcade boards, and so a desire to harmonise their arcade and home console market seems clear from the get-go of the 32-bit era. All kinds of arcade ports came to the Saturn, including this mammoth of a game, although the ports needed some downgrading in order to get them to run on the machine, due to the fact that while it was designed in a similar way to the System 32 and Model 1, the Saturn was definitely not equal in power to those two boards. 32-bit games have a reputation for being a bit rough around the edges visually, and this applies doubly for 3D Saturn games, as the developers struggled to harness the system's complex architecture. Sega Rally, however, was a stunning game when it was released, and it still looks pretty damn good even today, especially if you output your Saturn and SCART RGB. While the game is based on the arcade game, a hell of a lot of graphical changes had to be made to ensure the game would run at a smooth 30 frames per second on the Saturn. Non-transparencies were taken out, draw distances reduced, 3D models scaled down, and the screen resolution cut in half. However, despite all this, the game is certainly one of the best looking Saturn games out there, and I actually find myself being extremely impressed by it. Its bright visual aesthetic pops off the screen, and there is still quite a bit of detail. The music is quintessentially Sega, cheesy, over the top, catchy, and gets the blood pumping. Let's listen to a few standout tracks on the Saturn CD player, which lets you listen to the music from the game disc. For me, the reason why Sega Rally has withstood the test of time is because it is, quite frankly, one of the best racing physics engines I've ever played. Everything just feels right in Sega Rally, and there is a feeling of control that is unrivaled in other racing games. Sega Rally was one of the first games that allowed players to drive on different surfaces, asphalt, gravel and mud, and each of those surfaces actually has an effect on how the car handles. It's hard to explain, but Sega Rally is arcadey, but there is a great amount of skill required to perfect it and take the corners in the most efficient way possible. It's a game that's challenging but immensely rewarding at the same time. There are 3 tracks in the game, which if you were paying full whack for this back in the day probably felt like a bit of a rip-off. This tended to be the norm in Sega Saturn games, as many released with hardly any tracks. In a lot of cases this was down to the fact that the arcade games only had that many tracks to begin with, and so the console game reflected that. I mean, Sega could have created a few more tracks if they wanted, but I guess they didn't. In Sega Rally, you may initially think that 3 tracks is simply too few for a console racing game. However, you would be wrong. The goal in this game is not to win lots of different races in a career, but instead to completely master the 3 tracks that are here. You race against the clock and work your way up through the positions, with your time and ranking moving with you from one track to the other. You need to race so you have enough time to cross the finish line of each track, the remaining time being added to your start time of the next track. While battling the clock, you must also overtake as many cars as possible, with the goal of being in first position when crossing the final finish line. This takes try after try after try, and it becomes almost an obsession to shave off milliseconds from your time and overtake just one more car. This is unlike any other racing game I've played, and while extremely challenging, it's also great fun. If you finish first, you unlock a 4th track and a new car, which adds a bit more to the game. For this review, I really knuckled down to play and complete this game, and after many hours of playing, I still have not finished first. The highest I have placed is 4th, and to be frank, it took me ages just to be able to finish it all. So you will get many good hours of playing this game. There are 2 cars to choose from. Both have slight differences in the way they handle, but they are fairly similar. Plus you can tweak car performance to your liking in the options menu. As well as the arcade mode, there is a practice mode where you can practice any of the 3 tracks, a time attack mode where you can do multiple laps against a ghost car, and a 2-player mode split screen. Once you complete the game in first position, you unlock a new car and a new track, which can then be played in all modes. Sega Rally is a joy to play, even if sometimes the frustration sets in when playing tracks over and over and over again, with little gain in position or time. I'll admit that I've thrown my Saturn controller a few times in anger. Luckily, the Saturn controller is pretty robust. There's a reason the game is one of Saturn's best-selling and most beloved games. It's because it's well designed, great looking, and ultimately fun. I'd say get on eBay and pick up a copy right now. It's pretty cheap.